We have the light, we have the hole, and we have the receiver. We've established that these three things must align for a photograph to occur. We also established that the receiver, that is the sensitivity of the receiver in the modern day world, is what we call the ISO. It's the sensitivity of the sensor to light. We've also established that the time it takes for this hole to get wider or smaller is the shutter speed. However, the size of this hole in itself is what we refer to as the aperture. And in today's video, this is what we're going to be digging into. Let's go. Think of it this way. Imagine you have a window and the size of the window obviously matters. And if you look at the way windows are, buildings are built actually, if it's a toilet window, you see the window is really small. And because it's small, the room actually kind of like looks really, not so lit. But the bigger the window, obviously, the more light can come into the room and the brighter the room becomes. If you even like add windows to like your room, like a lot more windows to your room, obviously your room becomes brighter and brighter and brighter. Just imagine the aperture in that sense. If it opens really wide, obviously more light comes in, and if it's really small, less light comes in and it becomes darker. So when it comes to the aperture, the wider the aperture, the more light comes into the image. And how will I put it now? The slimmer, the shallower or the smaller the aperture, the less light comes into the image. It's that simple, it's that basic, it's that straightforward. But you see, sometimes it's when you start looking at the numbers, it starts to confuse you and all of that. The numbers are just supposed to represent what really means wide aperture or what really means a darker aperture. So if you look at the aperture, you can see that it's the wideness of that that window that we referred to earlier that will determine how much light comes into the image. But the aperture is calculated in stops of light, and the numbers go from a low value to a high value. Sometimes people get confused because of the way these numbers are arranged. But in order to just let you understand, and you can just take it straight up, that as the numbers go higher, it means the aperture is getting shallower. So if the aperture is getting shallower or smaller, what happens? In turn, the light gets less. It's like a smaller window. So as the number is going higher, just imagine the window is getting smaller. So as the window is getting smaller, the picture becomes darker. And as the numbers come down in numerical value, that is, maybe you come from a 4.5 to a 2.8, as the number is coming down, it means the aperture is widening up. The window is getting bigger and a lot more light can be let into the room. So as you do this, you realize that the picture starts to get brighter. So in order to get this theory straight up, the wider the aperture, the brighter the picture, and the shallower or smaller the aperture, what's happening? The darker the picture. But if you look at it from the number point of view, like the numerical point of view, the higher the number, the darker the image, and the lower the number, the brighter the image. Now let's talk about some of the features of the aperture. What else does the aperture do? How does it affect an image? You would notice that the aperture actually affects something called the depth of field. Depth of field is something we'll be talking about in another video. But to summarize it briefly, it means the areas in the picture that are sharp. Now, if you look at an image, there are some images where some part of it is sharp and some other parts within the image are not sharp. So it's that concept in itself is called the depth of field. The total area in the picture that is in focus, or I would say that is sharp. There are situations where you would see a portrait of somebody where their eyes will be sharp and their ears will be blurry. That's a very shallow depth of field, if I could say. It's very shallow because the distance between their eye and the ear is really short, and that means, it's a very shallow depth of field. There's situations where you could even see my eyes and see everything going on behind me. That means that's a wider depth of field. As you can see in this video, you can see that I'm very sharp. But towards the back, where the plants are, it's somewhat blurry. So the distance between my face and the part that still stays in focus is what we refer to as the depth of field. Now, this depth of field can be affected by a couple of things: the lens and most especially the aperture. Now, with the aperture, you can actually manage how much of the picture is in focus. You actually have to understand and see and observe how it affects the image, because it's going to determine how you apply it. Now, this is the second theory now. If you take the aperture and you widen it, that depth of field starts to become smaller. So imagine you have a very wide aperture, big window, and there's a lot of light in the room. The part of the image that you can put in focus will be very shallow, it will be very small. But as you close the aperture, as you close the opening in the lens, you are able to focus into a longer distance. So that way, the depth of field becomes wider. So in terms of real life applications now, you would see if you want to take a picture of a landscape, for example, where you want almost everything in the picture in focus, you want to use, a very shallow aperture, a very small window. However, if you want to take pictures where you have the subject in focus and you want everything in the background to be blurry, you want to use a wide aperture. Now, we've established that the aperture, as you widen it, the picture gets brighter, and as you make it smaller, the picture gets darker. That is how the aperture operates. But if you're going to talk about the behavioral pattern of the aperture, this is what I just talked about, the depth of field. Aperture actually affects the depth of field. So the wider the aperture, the shallower the depth of field. And the smaller the aperture, the wider, and the longer the depth of field. In order to apply this thing in real life, you can take a couple of objects and place them on the table and kind of like separate them from each other, and take the camera and place it in front of one of them and take pictures and see what it's like as you change the aperture from different values to different values as you go forward. You would see that more or less of the image will be in focus as you increase or decrease the aperture. If everything I'm saying is actually confusing you or you're not getting it, don't stress yourself about it. It's not that deep. All you need to do is begin to just practice these things and try them out. I'll still obviously upload a couple of videos where I'll be showing you the practical applications of some of these concepts. But I want you to just like sink into the idea of what the aperture, the ISO, and the shutter speed represents and what they mean. As far as the aperture is concerned, as we've said, is the widening or the size of that hole in the lens. And we've established that the wider the aperture, what happens? The brighter the picture. The smaller the aperture, the darker the picture. And it also affects the depth of field. And what does it do to it? As you widen the aperture, the wider the aperture, the shallower the depth of field. That means the less distance we have in the picture that is in focus. But as you make the aperture smaller, you see you have more space or more distance in the picture that is in focus. So with the aperture, you see how it actually affects lights. When you widen the aperture and more light comes into the image. Even the ISO affects light, even the shutter speed affects light. The three of them affect light, and that's the common factor between the three of them. What I want you to do right now is then to begin to play with the aperture, the ISO, and the shutter speed, and observe how they affect light. Observe those theories, observe how you increase or reduce each of those ones and what it does to the light. But also take note of the personal behaviors of each of these elements, which is one affects noise, one affects the depth of field, and one affects your ability to capture motion. So that's it for today's video. If you've learned anything, gained anything, if anything has been helpful or useful to you today, please let me know in the comments below. And if there's any other thing you want me to talk about, please let me know in the comments. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and put on your post notification button so that you can know when I'm posting new videos. See you next time.